How the Pigs Learned to See the Wind. Once upon a time, Mrs. Pig lived in a cozy house on a green hill with her 5 little pigs. 4 of them were shiny black, but her youngest, tiniest pig was Snow White, and he was the apple of her eye. Every evening, Mrs. Pig would tuck her little ones into bed and lock the door, for not far away lived Brother Wolf, and Brother Wolf had a mighty appetite for pig meat. Every night, when the stars twinkled and the moon shone bright, Brother Wolf would sneak to Mrs. Pig's garden, tiptoeing on soft paws. He'd circle her house, sniffing the air, and then, in a gentle voice, he'd call, Mrs. Pig, let me come in, the corn is ripe, and the frosts begin." But clever Mrs. Pig never opened her door. She'd lock it tight, and Brother Wolf would slink back home with an empty belly, dreaming of the day he'd get his paws on those pigs. One night, Brother Wolf hatched a sneaky plan. He put on his finest disguise, a tall hat, shiny shoes, and a neat necktie, and looked just like a proper gentleman. He slung a bag of corn over his shoulder and walked up the path, tramp, 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 right to Mrs. Pig's door. With a firm knock, he called out in his sweetest voice, Mrs. Pig, let me come in. The corn is ripe, and the frosts begin." Mrs. Pig peeked out of the window, holding her precious, white piglet in her arms. "Who's there?" she asked, her heart thumping. "Why, it's Mr. Man," Brother Wolf lied, tipping his hat. "I've come to mark your little pigs." Mrs. Pig, thinking it was indeed Mr. Man, opened the door and let out her 4 black pigs, but she kept the tiny white one hidden away in the cupboard, for he was her dearest. Brother Wolf emptied the corn from his bag, and quick as a flash, he scooped the 4 black pigs inside and slung the sack over his shoulder. He hurried off down the road, feeling mighty pleased with himself. A few days passed, and Brother Wolf grew hungry for more pig meat. This time, he dressed in his finest clothes again, grabbed another sack of corn, and marched right back to Mrs. Pig's house. He knocked loudly and called, Mrs. Pig, let me come in. The corn is ripe, and the frosts begin." Mrs. Pig's ears perked up. "Who's there?" she asked. "It's Mr. Man again," Brother Wolf replied. "I've come to mark your little white pig." But Mrs. Pig had learned her lesson. She barred the door, locked the windows, and hid her little white pig in the dresser. Brother Wolf, frustrated and furious, stormed away. As he stomped down the road, Brother Wolf ran into Mr. Wind, who was sweeping the fields with his powerful gusts. Mr. Wind wore a red cloak that billowed as he blew leaves and twigs across the countryside. "Why the long face?" Mr. Wind asked. Brother Wolf explained how badly he wanted those pigs. "I've tried everything, but Mrs. Pig outsmarts me every time." Mr. Wind grinned. "I love a good chase, and I never say no to fun. Let's give it a whirl." The 2 mischief makers hurried back to Mrs. Pig's house. Brother Wolf knocked loudly again, repeating his rhyme. Mrs. Pig, let me come in. The corn is ripe, and the frosts begin." This time Mrs. Pig didn't answer at all. She stayed as quiet as a mouse, holding her little white pig close. Brother Wolf turned to Mr. Wind. "Blow, Mr. Wind," he said. Mr. Wind took a deep breath and puffed himself up bigger and bigger. Then, with a mighty huff and puff, he blew a fierce gale through the garden. He shook the trees, tossed the corn into the air, rattled the windows, and slammed the door. He howled through the keyhole, "W-H-E, W-H-E, let me in." Brother Wolf was so scared that his fur stood up straight. He turned tail and ran, racing over the hills and through the forest, never to be seen near Mrs. Pig's house again. Still, Mr. Wind wasn't done. "W-H-E, W-H-E," he whistled as he swirled around the garden. Terrified, Mrs. Pig peeked out of her door, holding her white piglet tight, for he was her greatest treasure. Huff, puff, the wind blew the door wide open. With a gasp, Mrs. Pig scooped up her piglet and ran as fast as she could into the woods. She didn't return for a whole day and night, hiding until she was sure Mr. Wind had moved on. From that day forward, the pigs learned to fear the wind. And that's how pigs first came to see the wind. If you ever watch pigs in a garden, you'll notice that when Mr. Wind comes blowing through, they dash away, tails curling behind them, for they remember the day Mr. Wind huffed and puffed and scared them so.